Welcome, dear traveller, to another journey beneath the stars. Tonight, let us sail backward through time, to a place where frost kissed the mountains and fire slumbered deep beneath the stone. Picture it, a land carved by glaciers and myth, where the wind carries the breath of gods and the sea whispers secrets to those brave enough to listen. Fjords gleam like silver veins across the earth, and smoke from longhouses curls into a twilight sky. Here, in the hush before legend, the Northmen stir, farmers and warriors, poets and voyagers, their stories stitched into the fabric of snow and flame. If this voyage stirs your curiosity and wonder, lend us your support by liking and subscribing. Each gesture helps us share these stories with dreamers far and wide. So, nestle in, draw your blanket close, and let your eyelids grow heavy. For what follows is no mere tale, but a saga, a tapestry of memory and myth, of gods fading and hearts enduring. The fire crackles, the sea sighs, and our tale begins. In the hush before dawn, the first brush of sky-grey light touched the peaks of ice-swept mountains. A cold breeze threaded through the fjords, carrying brine from distant waters and the sharp scent of pine. Cliffs loomed like watchful sentinels over rippling inlets, their stone faces catching the faint shimmer of sunrise. Forests of birch and pine sank into shadowed hollows, their moss-laced floors hushed under a veil of frost. Hidden valleys nestled still pools that mirrored slow-drifting clouds. Beyond the tree line, tundra stretched stark and open, where only wiry lichens clung to stony soil. Here, the wind could rise in a savage chorus, and snow curled in restless spirals over the plains. In this stark land, where fire sometimes flowed beneath the ice, the Norse carved their lives. These were the ancestors of the Northmen, bound to soil and stone by memory and blood. In the south, the Danes built longhouses beside estuaries and tilled dark earth with practiced hands. The Swedes lived deeper inland, among herds and forest paths, crafting tools from horn with quiet skill. To the west, the Norwegians huddled in cliffside settlements where gulls wheeled on coastal winds. These tribes, unbound by kings, were ruled by kin and custom. Each family traced descent to named ancestors, and loyalty to kin eclipsed all else. Power rested with petty jarls, chieftains of timber halls where oaths echoed in smoky light. One such leader, Jarl Erik of the Fjord, held honor as tightly as he held his blade. His hall perched on a rocky outcrop, gazing out over a slender bay where longships would soon rest. Inside, hearth smoke curled upward, and firelight flickered on pelts tacked to the walls. Astrid, his wife, moved among the clan with quiet command, her voice steady as winter's tide. Their son, Bjorn, had his father's build and his mother's sharp-eyed curiosity. Their daughter, Freya, carved runes into bone and listened closely to the old tales, her fingers deft with insight. The land gave both bounty and burden. Farmers coaxed barley and peas from stubborn soil, while thralls, bonded labourers, tended livestock and repaired walls. At dawn, villagers led goats along narrow tracks or cast lines into brackish creeks. Gold and finely forged weapons marked the elite, gleaming symbols of power. In the jarls' feasting halls, goblets brimmed with mead and plates heaped with smoked meat. Beyond the carved doors, common folk sat on low benches with dark loaves and cold broth. Though divided by wealth, the tribes shared one faith. Odin, the one-eyed god, brooded at the center of their myths, seeker of wisdom and bearer of sacrifice. Thor stood beside him, hammer in hand, warding storm and enemy alike. On certain nights, the people gathered in clearings beneath ancient oaks, firelight casting shadows as goats were led to stone altars. A hush fell as the sideman's blade caught the flame's glint. Blood was poured to the soil, and runes were whispered like secrets. A vulva spread carved bones on a deerskin and read the paths of fate. The scent of pine resin mingled with chants, each rune a guide for hunts, voyages, or vengeance. Over time, the Norse shaped iron and oak as they shaped their futures. From thick trunks, boats emerged with dragon-headed prows and hulls stitched with iron rivets. Woolen sails striped in bold dyes caught the wind like wings. At first, these vessels hugged the coast for fishing, but soon the sea beckoned further. It stretched before them, dark and promising, calling toward unseen gold and foreign shores. In Jarl Eric's smithy, sparks flew as hammer met iron under a flickering lamp. Axe heads and spear tips took shape beside shield rims edged in steel. Halvard the smith, grey-bearded and soft-spoken, murmured to the gods as he worked, believing each blade bore spirit and blessing. Nearby, Astrid wove heavy cloaks, the whir of her loom matched by the stories she spun into thread. Simple patterns grew into curling beasts and storied sigils, memory stitched into wool. As winter neared, the tribes prepared for the Great Blot, festivals of sacrifice and remembrance. Meat was salted, ale was sealed in barrels, and furs were set aside for journeys of soul and snow. Anticipation stirred like coals in the chest, an ember of curiosity for what lay beyond the familiar tide. Seafarers etched coastal maps into planks, noting rocky points and landmarks like the troll's finger. Above them, the aurora borealis shimmered in veils of green, believed to be the shields of fallen warriors or the eyes of watching ancestors. On the eve of their first voyage, Jarl Eric stood by the fjord, watching his ship's dragon prow kiss the glassy water. Pride and gravity settled in his chest. Each mile ahead would leave something behind, but also carry hope for what might yet be found. He pressed a carved Odin talisman to the bow, sealing it with a drop of his blood. Then, with calm resolve, he called upon the sea to bear them true. Ropes creaked, the sail unfurled, and a hush swept over the shore as the longship slid forward. Its figurehead seemed to rise, alive in the mist, and behind it, the land of ice and fire blurred into cloud. So began the first stirrings of the Northman's age, carved by ice, warmed by fire, and carried by sea. As dawn's pale light slipped through a narrow wooden window, a woman stirred, rising to tend the hearth's dying embers. She gathered them gently, coaxing flame with straw and kindling, her breath a soft offering in the cold air. Outside, mist laced the meadows, and the bark of a hunting hound echoed faintly across dew-touched fields. In the longhouse's dim corners, others began to shift, dreams loosening like frost from boughs. Women, the weavers of warmth and fate, began their quiet craft, drawing threads smooth across the loom's sturdy frame. Each pass of warp and weft held care, turning raw fleece into cloaks and blankets for the biting months ahead. Their fingers danced silently, guided by rhythm and memory, spinning more than just cloth, spinning stories. Nearby, men readied for the hunt, blades tested on thumb pads and boots pulled tight against the chill. Their cloaks snapped as they stepped into the cold, breath rising in pale tendrils. Along the riverbank, fishermen cast lines for salmon, their small boats nodding with the current's pull. From the racks, smoke curled upward, scenting the morning with brine and wood. A mother stirred a pot of gruel over a steady flame, oats thickening as she moved her carved spoon with care. The aroma promised warmth, simple, sustaining, real. On the communal table, platters of smoked fish glistened beside loaves of barley bread. Tankards of coarse ale waited for farmhands, while mead, richer and rarer, stood for the Jarl's kin. Spice jars, rare and revered, rested high on a shelf, their foreign scents like distant memories. Every bite hard-won, each flavour cherished beneath watchful kin. Family life wove together duty and affection, strengthened by oaths first whispered in childhood. Marriages, often arranged, cemented clan alliances, while concubines, valued for wit or grace, lived nearer than the law acknowledged. Yet laughter bloomed in corners, a shared glance by the granary, fingers brushing as sacks were filled, small sparks allowed to glow beneath a lattice of law. In this world, women wielded more than looms. They spoke at the thing, presenting cases of honour and property. Some walked among stars and runes as seeresses, trusted voices beneath torchlit skies. This balance, this rooted symmetry, lent Norse life a quiet strength. Honour and kinship guided every choice. Vengeance, a solemn obligation, walked hand in hand with counsel. A boy learned of blood feuds from his father's lips, listening wide-eyed as caution coloured the old tales. Children practiced runes in the ash, small fingers carving shapes for strength and wisdom. At night, the skald recited sagas by firelight, each word a thread, tying gods and mortals to the present breath. Listeners leaned forward, drawn into distant lands and mighty deeds. The cadence soothed, wrapping listeners in a waking dream. In the forge, hammer rang on iron. The blacksmith, face lit by fire, breathed rhythm into each measured strike. Weapons born of flame and sweat carried more than steel. They bore names, legacies, protection. Inside the chieftain's hall, the Jarl listened as dusk gathered outside. His seat, carved with wolves and bears, bore the weight of long judgment. Disputes about meadows, spilled ale, and fractured pride were resolved in tones as firm as oak. Each decision, a binding of threads into law. Beyond those thick walls, the sea still called. But here, in the steady heartbeat of routine, duty, ritual, and kinship shaped the days. Dawn and dusk wove the people together, sun and shadow in equal measure. Women dyed wool with berries, drawing sky and earth into their work. Men returned from hunts with deer slung over shoulders, their triumph greeted with solemn gratitude. Feasts followed, meat, bread, ale, and raised voices. Evenings brought prayers whispered to Freyr for fields, to Thor for shielded hearths. Tiny wooden gods watched from windowsills, silent sentinels against dark. When winter pressed marrow to bone, hearth fires burned without pause. Stories stretched longer, and nearness became necessity. Women gathered to spin and speak of brave foremothers. Elder girls learned the arts of healing, herbs ground, salves stirred, fever soothed. Honour, vengeance, loyalty, they echoed with each changing season. In quiet moments, a lone figure traced runes on a pebble, hoping their shape might shield the soul. As night deepened, the longhouse quieted. Dreams wandered beyond snow and stone, carried by memory and myth. Life's rhythm slowed, curled close around kin and fire. The loom paused. The forge hushed. The embers glowed. A mother sang a lullaby in the old tongue, each word a thread of warmth. And within that stillness, the Norse heart beat strong beneath the stars. Dawn broke over the starlit fjord, turning its waters into ribbons of silver. In the shipwright's yard, wooden beams lay in patient order, smoothed and shaped beneath calloused hands. Hulls awaited their keels, resting upon stout supports under an open sky. At the centre, priests of Njord gathered near a half-raised longship, bowls of fresh blood held reverently from a dawn sacrifice. One chanted a tide-like invocation to the sea god. Another marked the dragon prow with crimson dots, careful and sure. The scent of pine tar mingled with iron and incense, binding ship to God. Runes were chiselled into keel and stem, each mark a plea for calm waters. Men bowed their heads, feeling the old weight of fate scored into wood. A hammer's rhythm joined the scene as nails were tested for strength. Women offered barley cakes and ale to nourish the builders, their presence grounding the ritual with sustenance. The forge rang softly. Metal, fire, purpose. Between the strikes, salt spray drifted from the sea, bringing its familiar sting. Whispers moved among the shipwrights, fear, ambition, excitement. The fjords had long fed them, but now grew tight with kin and claim. Young sons dreamed beyond boundaries, beyond grudges and tangled bloodlines. Distant chieftaincies stirred with unrest. Valleys echoed with feuds, and rumours crept through the halls, of abbeys weakly guarded, of gold hidden in prayer-heavy silence. Frankish riches gleamed in tales, and the unknown called louder than the hearth. At the water's edge, longships rested like sleeping beasts, carved prows curled in frozen breath. A young man stepped forward, gaze fixed on the prow's painted eyes. Leif, slender, strong, with wheat-coloured hair, stood with purpose. At his side, Astrid, his betrothed, pulled her cloak tight, fingers trembling in the cold. She pressed a small leather pouch into his hand, lingering on the touch. Inside was a bone charm etched in runes, her gift, her protection, her hope. Leif's throat closed at the feel of it. He knelt, kissed her gloved knuckles, warm breath against the morning wind. Behind them, family gathered, heads bowed in prayer to Freya for safe return. A priest sprinkled seawater over the prow, his voice low and solemn. Leif stepped aboard as the tide rose beneath the keel. Other ships aligned in formation, dragon heads forward, fierce and silent. Oars rested in their thwarts, ready to bite the sea. The crew settled shoulder to shoulder, strength coiled in stillness. A skald stood beside Leif, lyre in hand, song forming like mist. With a nod from the Jarl's son, Leif dipped his oar into water. The fleet moved like one creature, bodies rising and falling in rhythm. Each stroke pulled them farther from home, deeper into fate. Mist curled around the ships, softening sky and sea. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries both omen and farewell. Hours passed. The shoreline faded into mist and memory. Leif stared westward, heart pounding with wonder and fear. At the edge of a cold morning, longships crouched by the shore like beasts in waiting. A hush settled as oarsmen took their places, shoulders brushing in quiet solidarity. The hulls groaned softly beneath them, breath rising in silver threads. Beyond the waterline, a hooded cirrus traced runes into damp earth. Each mark shimmered briefly before fading, like whispers offered to fate. Her eyes, grey as storm tide, caught the flicker of torchlight. She spoke not in volume, but in rhythm, soft cadences that braided glory and ruin. Around her, silence thickened. Ragnar Lodbrok stood at the circle's edge, hair braided tight against the wind. His sons flanked him, tense, alert, eyes lit with questions they dared not ask aloud. The seeress warned of distant gold, but also of blades born from fear. As her voice faded, the drums began, slow, deliberate. Oars dipped with practiced grace, sending the fleet slipping into grey waters. The longships moved as one, each stroke a breath drawn in anticipation. Men searched the mist for signs, stone spires, prayer halls, whitewashed walls. Below deck, a young warrior gripped his axe, tasting salt and iron. He whispered no prayer, only breathed, to steady, to remember. When the keel kissed the shallows, boots met sand with a sound like thunder stilled. Shields rose. A horn sounded, low and deep, stirring marrow and memory. Across the monastery fields, Monks paused mid-prayer, glancing skyward. The clash was sudden. Metal against wood. The jarring ring of entry. Bells tolled in protest. Axes cleaved hinges and hearts alike, but not without pause. Even amid chaos, discipline held. Raiders moved through cloisters like shadows with purpose. Chalices were gathered gently. Some met praying eyes and chose silence over blood. A scuffle echoed between pillars, swift and contained. Then, as fast as they'd come, the Norse withdrew. Oars struck water, and the ships vanished into dawn's fog. On board, breaths came hard, eyes wide. Victory carried weight. Ragnar regarded the spoils, chalices, silks, and sorrow alike. His eldest son touched his arm, wordless comfort passing between them. High on the cliffs, the seeress watched. She felt tides shift, glory fraying at the edges, storms unborn. The fleet curled through quiet inlets, starlight glinting on wet wood. Laughter rose, low, reverent. Tales unfurled in broken sentences, stitched with pride and unease. A young berserker spoke of fury sparked by fly agaric, his eyes alight, his hands trembling. A former serf, now warrior, stared skyward, wondering what his children might one day sing. Soft voices sang a dirge for fallen foes, the sea echoing their grief back in sighs. A single lantern swung at the prow, guiding through the dark like a memory. Elsewhere, monks returned to shattered halls. They knelt by broken icons, tears bright on cold stone. But among the wreckage, a vow flickered, a promise to endure. Far across the fjords, news stirred councils. Jarls gathered beneath worn banners, plans whispered. Spears readied. The Norse knew the sea's rhythm, how tide rose and receded. In each village, torchlight marked the vigil. Kinship held strong, honor wove through night like thread. Back home, families waited by firelight. Women traced runes in ash, seeking signs in ember patterns. When sails appeared on the horizon, the hush deepened. Oars lifted, cheers stifled. Eyes scanned for scars or smiles. Ragnar embraced his children, voice low. No judgment, just return. The seeress's warning lingered, a hum beneath the drums. Inside the hall, the lute gleamed, but not louder than the tales told. Stories of resistance, restraint, and a fragile mercy. Voices softened. The hearth crackled, and sleep came, not as command, but as invitation. Let dreams carry warriors and monks alike into realms of shadow and truth. For in the space between raid and return, kinship and conscience endure. A low mist curled over green fields, soft as breath, where timber-framed homes rose from the earth. Long houses leaned into each other like old kin, thatched roofs shedding the chill of early morning. Axes rang in rhythm. As settlers carved beams from oak, wood once kissed by northern frost. Smoke curled from fresh-hewn chimneys, scented with pine resin and peat. This was a new land, but the old pulse remained. At the edge of the settlement, a Jarl's hall stood tall, its door bound in iron and hope. Sunlight winked off bronze rings and twisted gold bands that marked lineage and lore. Outside the hall, thralls bent over furrows, turning soil rich with unfamiliar promise. Their breath rose in clouds, mingling with the drone of gulls and traders' banter from the riverbank. In the muddy clearing, a girl pressed dye from heather into wool, her hands stained plum and ash. She worked beside her mother, who wove patterns that blended Norse curves with local knots, art evolved by migration. Each thread held memory. Each line held myth. Trade swelled the village's heart. Irish merchants came with salt-brined salmon and stories. Frankish peddlers swapped honeyed wine for amber and pelts. Words tumbled between tongues. Norse, Gaelic, Latin, all tasted like river water and campfire. Children born of mingled blood chased dogs through the market, shouting with blended cadence. They laughed in two languages, feet bare, futures unbound. At dusk, a bard tuned his lyre beside the hearth. He sang not only of Odin's wanderings, but of an aging skald who lost his voice to grief and found it again beside a Welsh sea. The hall listened, heads bowed, tears caught in beard and braid alike. Monks, now scribes in Norse employ, inked scrolls in candlelight. Runes and Latin twined like ivy along vellum, sagas scribed with reverence and skill. Some whispered that stories would now outlive memory, that ink could do what ash never could. The Jarl's hall roared with laughter on feast days. Mead horns passed between warriors and farmers, their songs rising like smoke. Outside, thralls shared porridge and beer, their own circle bright with simpler joy. One lad played a bone flute beneath a crooked tree, and an old woman clapped time, smiling without teeth. Yet not all was mirth. In England's Danelaw, assembly gatherings took shape beneath oak canopies. Free men spoke of justice, their words split between rune and Latin. Women stood beside them, claiming dower rights and property with voices clear as spring melt. In Normandy, Viking blood ran in veins that now carried French vowels. Children of jarls rode beside Frankish squires, hunting deer through chateau woods. One girl, born of both lineages, swung her blade with grace, her laughter unsettling knights twice her age. Inside Ruin's great hall, a shield maiden leaned against a pillar. Her hair, the colour of flame, glinted beneath chainmail. Leif knelt before her, offering a ring forged from a stolen chalice. Her smile curved slow, half myth, half promise. They rode toward the surf, long ship keels carving new futures into sand. Their home was no longer a place, but a braid of stories, salt and steel. Still, in the corners of those great halls, unseen hands laboured. Thralls turned clay into pots, carved toys from scrap wood for laughing children. One boy traced runes in ash, murmuring a prayer to Freya for freedom he could not yet name. Night brought quiet to the longhouses. A hush fell over the rafters, where dragons and wolves stared down from carved beams. The fire burned low. The stories began. Skalds told of gods who lost wars, and mortals who made peace. Listeners drifted into dreams, the scent of heather and mead clinging to their sleep. By morning, hammers would ring again. But for now, in this land both new and old, sagas rooted themselves in soil and song. The wind carried them beyond fields and fjords, to places where memory dared to begin anew. Before dawn, the grove held its breath. Ancient oaks stood watch, their roots deep in stories whispered long before stone churches rose. Moss cushioned every step as worshippers moved through fog and fir, cloaked in silence. A priest of Freyr knelt by a worn altar, the surface blackened with years of blood and ash. He whispered the boar's name before the blade fell. The creature shuddered once, then stilled. Steam rose from the bowl where blood pooled, bright as sunrise, bitter as memory. Beside him, a priestess of Freya arranged marigolds and flax, murmuring thanks for beauty, war, and the space between. She tipped honeyed mead into a carved bowl, her fingers trembling at the edges. Worshippers passed single grains of rye through the smoke, blessings to be buried in spring fields. Above, crows called across the pale sky, neither omen nor comfort. Further in, women circled the silver-threaded well of the Norns. They whispered hopes into the water, watching ripples distort their reflections. One girl, no older than 13, traced her future in the shimmer, marriage, childbirth storms. She said nothing, only nodded, as if she'd known all along. A young warrior waited at the grove's edge, his fingers brushing the haft of an axe. He imagined Valhalla, golden halls, endless mead, but he also remembered his mother's psalm, sung in secret near the hearth. Faith lived in many forms, he thought, some louder than others. Skalds recited tales by firelight, Odin's sacrifice, Loki's mischief, the weaving of word. Their words fell soft as snow, but carried weight like stone. Yet even as old rites bloomed in shadows, new faith crept in with daylight. Boats with white sails and painted crosses moored at fjordside villages. Monks in woolen robes came ashore with relics, scrolls, and soft words about grace. Some jarls welcomed them, drawn by alliance and trade. They knelt beside fonts, their hands wet with baptism and calculation alike. Beneath vaulted stone arches, they gave up carved idols for promises of land and peace. But others did not yield. In the frost-lit silence of midnight, farmers still left bread and bone at hidden shrines. A child's rune etched into heartwood pulsed with fear and hope. In far villages, women toasted Freya beneath new moons, their voices hushed but certain. Atop the steeple, a bell tolled. Below, beneath furs and frost, old gods stirred in memory. Some merged faiths. A fisherman wore a hammer at his neck and crossed himself before casting nets. A mother taught her daughter both the Lord's Prayer and the binding charms of her foremothers. In mead halls the tension hummed. Jarls debated between oaths sworn in blood and vows signed in Latin. A chieftain's counsellor warned of crop failure should the gods be ignored. Another nodded toward a crucifix and whispered, "But what if this god listens louder?" Change came slowly, like thaw in early spring. Idols were buried under thresholds. Crosses carved beside hammers on the same mantle. When an old chieftain died, both priests came, one with incense, the other with runes. He was sent off on a pyre with sword, shield, and psalm. Ashes scattered, prayers mingled. A raven landed on the burnt frame, silent and watching. The mourners stilled. No one spoke of omens, but everyone felt the weight of the bird's gaze. Time passed. Groves fell. Chapels rose. But faith didn't vanish. It folded. It clung in the corners, beneath floorboards, behind lullabies. Children lit candles for Christ and whispered wishes to Thor when storms shook the rafters. In that quiet mingling, something endured. A dual breath, a shared sky, and in the hush of sleep, gods, old and new, stood side by side beside the dreaming fire. The spring sun rose pale over the wooden palisades of Harold Fairhair's hall, brushing the timbers with a soft amber light. Eric, once a swift raider, now stood on the threshold of allegiance, clad not in the armour of war, but the weight of intent. Wildflowers scented the breeze from the meadow beyond, mingling with the tang of damp earth. Inside, the longhouse murmured with low voices. Tapestries of goats and dragons shimmered with silver thread in the firelight. Torches sputtered quietly, casting flickers against beams darkened by time. At the far end of the hall, Harold's throne loomed, draped in crimson cloth and backed by heaps of Byzantine coins and silver brooches, tooled with runes and knotwork. Jarls in ermine and dyed wool shifted in their seats. Their breath hung in the cool air, mingling with the steam rising from goblets of warmed mead. Eric's gaze drifted to Astrid beside him. Her mail caught the light in tiny flashes, each ring a spark of her unyielding calm. In her presence, his shoulders unknotted. Beyond the threshold, the fjord was still as polished obsidian. Longships resting like beasts at slumber. Water lapped softly, a slow rhythm echoing in Eric's pulse. The mingled aromas of roasted boar and spiced wine teased at feasts to come. But it was the silence, the stillness before choice, that pressed deepest. Across the benches, Jarl Sigurd and Thorfinn, Eric's uncle, traded terse nods. In this fragile new order, rivalries bowed to necessity, though old eyes still watched with measured doubt. From the dais, Harold's voice rumbled, not loud, but dense with purpose, as he spoke of roads, tribute, and the forging of a kingdom. Words like unity and shared prosperity carried the sharp edge of inevitability. Some jarls stiffened at taxes, but Harold's gleaming chalice, raised like a pact, soothed resistance. Eric stood tall. He remembered the clamour of oars, the clash of foreign steel, the hollowed eyes of monks. That world, fierce, free, fleeting, lay behind him now. Before him, a realm of ink, roads, and ruled land. A steward approached with a carved oak staff. Eric stepped forward, kneeling on a fur skin dyed dark with bear oil. His sword's pommel dug into his thigh. Harold laid his own gold-ringed hand upon his blade and raised a horn filled with wine the colour of bloody dawn. "Rise, Eric of Stoneford Vale," Harold intoned, "and take your place among my loyal jarls." Eric rose, feeling not just the steel at his waist, but the weight of a name changed. Astrid's hand found his arm, silent, sure. Two yeomen brought forth a shield bearing the raven banner. Around the hall, silk whispered as men shifted. Quills scratched, recording oaths as ravens circled unseen. Sigurd's gaze clung to the seal ring at Eric's side, but said nothing. Words weren't needed. Ambition had many faces. Just as the ink dried on the charter, a messenger entered, wind-bitten and breathless. He bore news of Svein Forkbeard, an alliance with foreign earls, a challenge to Harold's rising order. Whispers surged like fire in dry moss. Astrid and Eric exchanged a glance, a flicker of tension beneath their calm. Outside, a raven called from the ridge. Omen or coincidence? None dared guess aloud. That night, in their private chamber, they sat by the fire. The flame painted gold along Astrid's jaw and cast long shadows on the stone. She smoothed the fur at Eric's feet. "We must guard both our hearts and our oaths," she said. Her voice, low and steady, held the quiet conviction of someone who had bled for peace. Eric nodded, recalling the vow they'd made beneath the northern lights, his lips to her wrist, her blade to his. He kissed her brow, where sweat and salt mingled. Rain whispered against the roof. The scent of damp pine drifted in, grounding them in this world they now shaped. In the courtyard below, labourers hauled timber for halls they would never sit in. Some grumbled of taxes, others dreamed of peace. He thought of the children in his household, thralls learning to spin wool, not wield blades. He vowed justice tempered by memory, and mercy for those who bore the weight of his choices. By the hearth, Astrid's armour hung silent. A meal of salted fish and warm mead eased their silence. Candlelight shimmered like stars across the carved mead horn in Eric's hand. He traced the markings with a thumb, recalling the saga his father once told as a fire died low. Astrid opened the vellum book of family vows. The ink had faded to sepia, but each word still breathed. Far off, a bell tolled from a distant chapel. Its sound folded into the night air, part promise, part farewell. They prayed in silence. Odin for strength, Christ for a better world. When Eric closed his eyes, the hush was no longer heavy. It was full of tomorrow. A pale light glimmered over the river Dnieper, its surface smooth as polished bronze. Leif, eldest son of Eric and Astrid, leaned on his oar as the merchant Nar glided past forested banks thick with pine and early mist. The air was clean, laced with the faint smoke of distant hearths. This voyage bore no dragon prow, no shields hung from the gunwales. Instead, a carved ram's head marked their intent: trade, not war. Leif's boots creaked on damp planks as he scanned the banks. Nearby, Ingrid, his younger sister, unfurled a hide map streaked with charcoal lines. Her fingers followed their course from Gardariki toward the golden domes of Constantinople. The map rippled in the breeze like a snake shedding skin. They carried bolts of dyed wool, honey, and brooches etched with Norse knots. Their aim was not plunder, but saffron, silk, and Byzantine coin. Astrid, now matriarch and mentor, knelt on deck threading silver into a pouch with patient fingers. Trade, she'd taught them, demands courage tempered by restraint. Villagers waved from the banks, holding baskets of cherries and loaves wrapped in broad leaves. Leif traded mead for soft bread filled with cheese and herbs, the flavour sharp and bright on his tongue. The crew murmured, thanks to Njord for calm waters and generous strangers. Farther south, the river widened. Red loam darkened the banks near Kiev, where apple trees lined the approach. Domes glinted in the sun, and market cries rose like gulls. Merchants hawked fox pelts, amber beads, and whetstones. A Slavic woman pressed a warm pastry into Leif's hands, smiling without a word. Ingrid wandered the scriptorium beside a Greek monk, transcribing sagas into mixed runes and Greek letters. She traced a finger across the parchment and whispered, "Stories shape the world." Astrid stood quietly behind her, pride glinting in her eyes like polished steel. The Nar slipped beneath a wooden bridge into Constantinople's grand harbour. Marble columns rose like petrified trees, and tiled roofs shimmered in reds and golds. The call to prayer mingled with forge hammers and the wail of traders. Leif inhaled salt, spice, and ink, and felt small in the best of ways. On the docks, their goods were swapped for rosewater, madder-dyed silk, and copperwork from Damascus. A ruse merchant named Marina, fluent in Norse and Slavic, joined their party. Her amber pendant glowed warm in the light. She led Leif and Ingrid through the market maze where scents of cardamom and sandalwood clung to the air. In one stall, Leif paused before a brass bowl, etched with desert stars. The craftsman spoke of oases and caravan trails. Ingrid translated, but Leif was already hearing the story in the metal's texture. Astrid noted how women here bargained beside men, their words sharp and sure. "Diplomacy," she murmured to Leif, "wields more weight than steel." He nodded, watching Marina haggle without apology. That night, they gathered in a lamplit courtyard. Musicians plucked lyres as pomegranate wine passed from hand to hand. Ingrid began writing their own saga. Soft runes mixed with careful letters, inked beneath the gaze of old gods and new. The air thrummed with stories. Leif, seated beside the fire, felt a shift inside him. The sea still called, but now so did words, trade routes, names whispered in foreign tongues. He dipped a quill, its tip glinting like a spearhead, and began to write. The world, he realized, could be shaped by ink as surely as by iron. A hush fell over the deck of the Nar as the sea shifted into glass. On the horizon, a ribbon of pale green glowed between forest and sky. Leif stood at the bow, his fingers gripping the rail, breath caught in his chest. Salt clung to his lips. The coast ahead, low hills draped in spruce and fir, rose like a memory half-formed, ancient yet unseen. Behind him, sailors adjusted the sail in silence. No drums beat, no horns blared. The wind whispered through the rigging, gentle as breath over skin. In that stillness, the world felt paused, like a rune unspoken. At landfall, boots sank into soft moss. A woman laughed quietly at the bounce beneath her step. Birds with unfamiliar cries wheeled above them. Beneath the pines, wild grapes drooped in tangled abundance, staining fingertips deep purple. The scent of ferment and loam clung to the air, sweet and strange. They named it Vinland. Tents sprang up beside a clear stream. Woolen hides stretched tight against wooden frames. Smoke curled from their first fire as fish hissed over the flame. Leif watched the wood crackle and pop, felt the ground beneath him, solid, unmapped. Stories came quickly, passed from lip to eager ear. Thorvald, his son, spoke of towering trees and glinting lakes, his voice wide-eyed, his hands sketching each turn of the coast. Even the stones feel different, he said. They hum. But this land held secrets beneath its stillness. Snow came sudden, fierce. One night of hard frost turned green to white. Singing quieted. Food thinned. A woman clutched her child as wind slashed through the trees, her cloak not thick enough for this unknown winter. In the forge, Thorvald shaped iron with stiff fingers, sparks flying like fireflies. "We should have brought more salt," someone muttered. Leif walked among the tents, laying hands on shoulders, murmuring prayers to Njord and Freya. But even his faith felt far from home. Then came the first arrows. Scouts returned with shafts of wood tipped in flint. One was stained dark at the edge. No words came from the woods, only the glint of watching eyes. Clashes were brief. Shouts beneath red-leafed branches, steel on bark, breath on frozen air. Blood darkened the snow near the stream. Then silence. A truce followed, thin as ice in spring. In the hush of dawn, the village church's wooden gates creaked open, groaning like old timbers remembering storms. Beneath arches of fresh carved stone, raised where sacred groves once stood, a congregation gathered. The scent of incense mingled with pine resin and morning mist, weaving old and new into the breath of the air. Songbirds stirred in rafters above the unfinished nave, where limestone blocks lay half-shaped beneath the mason's mallet. Candlelight licked the walls, glimmering off frescoes of solemn saints painted over plaster that had yet to dry. Voices rose in soft hymns, unfamiliar yet earnest, echoing where once only runes had been chanted beneath green boughs. Monks moved silently in woolen robes, adjusting iron braziers that shed warmth across cold flagstones. Their steps echoed, distant thunder beneath the weight of change. Beyond the altar, a slim priest rang a polished bell, 12 silver peals for the rite of baptism. Near the threshold stood the elder, his beard silvered with time, fingers curled around the carved head of his staff. He watched as his grandchildren stepped toward the font, faces lit with awe and confusion. A breeze stirred the banners overhead. Outside, barley swayed in fields once blessed by another name. Tithes of grain and cloth were laid on the altar, recorded in ink by the reeve's careful hand. Now the laws demanded signatures and witnesses, not oaths whispered beside firelight. Polygynous bonds of the chieftains had given way to monogamous vows beneath the eye of the church. Each union, blessed by a priest, replaced the tangled ties of clan and heart. The children knelt, flinching as cold water touched their brows. The priest murmured prayers in Latin, words strange as birdsong in winter. They rose with shining eyes, baptized not just in water, but in the growing certainty of a new world. Outside, echoes of the old ways clung to shaded hollows. The ex-vulva, once a seeress feared and sought, wore a nun's habit now. She moved among herb beds with quiet devotion, tending the infirm with hands still marked by ancient rites. Beneath her breath, sometimes she mouthed old chants as she plucked yarrow and mugwort, their scents stirring memories like embers in ash. The archbishop's decree had banished the runes from speech, but not from memory. At dusk, a few old believers still wandered into the woods. There, by ancient stones in a mossy ring, they buried their gods in silence. Small carved idols, wrapped in cloth, were placed in a shallow grave. No fire, no feast, only a shared cup of watered ale and a whispered farewell to Thor and Freyr. Their voices rose once more, soft as wind through pine, before falling forever still. By morning, dew gleamed over the burial mound. No trace remained for patrolling soldiers to find. Back in the village, the elder returned to his longhouse, its slate roof a far cry from the smoke holes of his youth. A wooden cross hung above the hearth where once a spear of ash had stood. Supper was simple: salted fish, barley porridge, and ale shared in stillness. In the hush of dawn, the village church's wooden gates creaked open, groaning like old timbers remembering storms. Beneath arches of fresh-carved stone, raised where sacred groves once stood, a congregation gathered. The scent of incense mingled with pine resin and morning mist, weaving old and new into the breath of the air. Songbirds stirred in rafters above the unfinished nave, where limestone blocks lay half-shaped beneath the mason's mallet. Candlelight licked the walls, glimmering off frescoes of solemn saints painted over plaster that had yet to dry. Voices rose in soft hymns, unfamiliar yet earnest, echoing where once only runes had been chanted beneath green boughs. Monks moved silently in woolen robes, adjusting iron braziers that shed warmth across cold flagstones. Their steps echoed, distant thunder beneath the weight of change. Beyond the altar, a slim priest rang a polished bell, 12 silver peals for the rite of baptism. Near the threshold stood the elder, his beard silvered with time, fingers curled around the carved head of his staff. He watched as his grandchildren stepped toward the font, faces lit with awe and confusion. A breeze stirred the banners overhead. Outside, barley swayed in fields once blessed by another name. Tithes of grain and cloth were laid on the altar, recorded in ink by the reeve's careful hand. Now the laws demanded signatures and witnesses, not oaths whispered beside firelight. Polygynous bonds of the chieftains had given way to monogamous vows beneath the eye of the church. Each union, blessed by a priest, replaced the tangled ties of clan and heart. The children knelt, flinching as cold water touched their brows. The priest murmured prayers in Latin, words strange as birdsong in winter. They rose with shining eyes, baptized not just in water, but in the growing certainty of a new world. Outside, echoes of the old ways clung to shaded hollows. The ex-vulva, once a seeress feared and sought, wore a nun's habit now. She moved among herb beds with quiet devotion, tending the infirm with hands still marked by ancient rites. Beneath her breath, sometimes, she mouthed old chants as she plucked yarrow and mugwort, their scent stirring memories like embers in ash. The archbishop's decree had banished the runes from speech, but not from memory. At dusk, a few old believers still wandered into the woods. There, by ancient stones in a mossy ring, they buried their gods in silence. Small carved idols, wrapped in cloth, were placed in a shallow grave. No fire, no feast, only a shared cup of watered ale and a whispered farewell to Thor and Freyr. Their voices rose once more, soft as wind through pine, before falling forever still. By morning, dew gleamed over the burial mound. No trace remained for patrolling soldiers to find. Back in the village, the elder returned to his longhouse, its slate roof a far cry from the smoke holes of his youth. A wooden cross hung above the hearth where once a spear of ash had stood. Supper was simple: salted fish, barley porridge, and ale shared in stillness. Under a blood-red sky, the golden lions of Normandy rippled above London's blackened walls. Smoke coiled from scorched thatch as defenders hurled boiling oil from parapets. The thunder of hooves replaced the silent glide of longships. Viking descendants now rode as lords in foreign courts, their axes sheathed in royal scabbards. Far across the sea, in Norway's frostbitten valleys, messengers brought grim news. The raiding routes had vanished, sealed by watchtowers that lit warning fires at first sight of sails. Longships, once sharp as wolves' teeth, now lay idle in fjords too still for war songs. Only the cries of gulls echoed above the empty harbours. An elder sat by his hearth, tracing the serpent etchings on his battered shield. He remembered the rush of wind as oars churned foam, the surge of fear and fire. But those shores, once open, wild, and full of spoils, now bristled with stone walls and steel-clad kings. The age of taking had passed. The homeland too betrayed its sons. Crops failed under shifting skies. Famine shadowed the valleys. Fields lay fallow, their golden promise turned to ash. Peasants, gaunt and embittered, rose against jarls who still demanded tribute. Within smoky halls, kin turned on kin. Feuds bloomed not from honour but desperation. Blades rang out, but without glory. And yet, across the North Sea, sagas were still sung. In Anglo-Danish taverns, old names like Ragnar and Sigurd stirred cheers and tears alike. Skalds plucked their lyres by torchlight, weaving tales now worn with nostalgia. Their fingers trembled on the strings, but the verses held fast. Beneath the aurora borealis, two aged lovers stood atop a snow-blown ridge. He wore sable fur. She carried a single torch that painted gold across the frost. Once they had raided side by side, their youth burned bright in the memory of distant coasts. Now her hair bore silver threads, and his sword hand trembled with age. He placed an ivory comb in her hair, a relic from long-ago conquest. She touched his weathered face, her fingertips brushing years as if smoothing cloth. They spoke little. The silence between them held what words could not. Rings of twisted silver passed between them, a final vow for days no prayer could restore. In their parting, the old gods stirred. Back in the villages, hearths dwindled to embers. Thralls slipped away under cover of night, seeking coin in foreign ports or vanishing on frostbitten roads. The elder watched wagons creak down the trail, laden with everything a life could carry. He touched the raven brooch at his throat, its jet eyes unreadable. The wind screamed through streets where once spices were sold and smithies rang. Bells tolled more often now, not for feast or gathering, but for burial and prayer. The sermons condemned the old gods. Even carving runes drew penance. Yet frost still bore hammers, traced by tiny hands on window panes. One child, cheeks red from cold, drew Thor's mark in the snow. His mother swept him inside, but the shape lingered, melting slowly. In the forests, exiled skalds sang alone. Their songs curled through pine and salt-laced air, elegies to a world unravelling. At a solitary shrine by the shore, a runestone stood half-sunken in moss. The elder knelt there, laying dried fish at its base. He whispered in Old Norse, the syllables slow and soft, like the tide receding. He dreamed of longships once more, sails full under starlight, the sea hissing against the hull. But when he woke, his hands held only cold stone. New laws came. No ship launched without royal writ. The longships were dismantled, their bones fed to fire. As dawn spread pale gold across the fjord, mist clung to the water like a veil between worlds. The air was crisp, still, and waiting. In the dim hush of the longhouse, The elder rose from his bench beside the hearth. His joints ached, but his hands were steady as he reached for a worn, leather-bound book. He gathered the grandchildren, barefoot and tousle-haired, into a circle near the fire. Their eyes, wide and eager, caught the ember light. Outside, gulls cried above the tide, and fishing boats with patched sails creaked against the current. The sea still whispered its old language, even if fewer voices spoke it. The elder opened the book. Inked runes and sagas stretched across vellum pages, each line a pulse from the past. He cleared his throat and began softly, his voice a mix of gravel and melody. He crossed storm, lashed seas, with oars like wings and the wind in his beard. The children leaned close, breath fogging in the chill, caught between story and silence. As the tale wound through storms and gods, feasts and fallings, the room held stillness like reverence. These were no longer just stories. They were the bones of memory, the shape of something half-remembered and wholly real. Beyond the walls, the world had changed. Cathedrals rose in stone where oaks once stood. Lore was carved now in Latin scrolls, not in runes. Ships bore silk and spice, not shields. But within the pages of the elder's book, the sagas still stirred. He paused to let the words settle, the way his father had. Then he closed the book and set it gently aside. The youngest reached up to touch the rune on his grandfather's hand. "What does this one mean?" The elder smiled. "Belonging," he said. "It means we are still here." They moved to the door, blinking into the morning light. On the distant slope, sheep grazed under a sky painted soft blue. The fjord shimmered like hammered silver. Somewhere, a raven called, not ominous, just present. A watcher, like the elder himself. He lifted his gaze toward the mountains, their peaks draped in old snow. Once, those slopes echoed with the cries of warriors. Now, they held only wind and the distant thrum of tools in the fields. But memory had not faded. At night, the children would trace their own names in ash by the hearth. They would hum the sagas under their breath as they carried water or spun wool. They would learn psalms and prayers, but also the rhythm of rowing, the shape of sails, the silence before the storm. The elder returned inside, where the fire had caught again. He stirred the coals with a practiced hand and whispered an old blessing in a tongue barely spoken. In that hush, nothing was gone, not truly, and so the North remembered, not through conquest or cries, but in the quiet endurance of those who stayed. In every rune passed hand to hand, every song hummed at twilight, every tale told beside the hearth. The sagas lived. The gods, perhaps, listened still, and the children, wrapped in wool and wonder, listened too. And so, the long twilight of the Viking world descends, quiet not with defeat, but with the hush of memory held close. From the shimmer of the aurora to the warmth of a longhouse hearth, we have journeyed through fire and fjord, through the rise of empires and the fall of runestones. The gods have whispered and waned, sails have stilled, but the heartbeat of the north lingers, soft as the hush before snow, steady as the stories passed from elder to child. As you drift into sleep, may echoes of this saga carry you, on long ships of dream, across seas of starlight. If you feel the pull of this ancient world, let us know in the comments below. And rest assured, new stories, woven of history and wonder, await you here again soon. For now, close your eyes, let the ambient music cradle your thoughts, and surrender to the gentle tide of dreams. The North remembers, and so do we.